Now, because of my burgeoning interest in the terminology of all things blade, in which I do not consider myself to be really very knowledgeable at all, but I got my little niches and I certainly am interested. And so the topic is going to be bevels and primary bevel, secondary bevel, tertiary bevel. And I understood things a certain way because I looked into it, and what I learned made sense to me, which is that, let's take, for example, this knife, this blade here. This is a saber grind. So we have a flat here, and then we have this bevel here, and then we have that one there, right? So flat and two bevels. Now, which is the one that does the cutting? And what I've just discovered really today, and by the way, something I also discovered today, I kept hearing people talking about mil spec, right? And I never knew what mil spec meant. I say I kept hearing, but I've been out of the loop. I used to live in Spain for 10 years. I spoke Spanish every day. And if I see mil, to me, M-I-L, that means 1,000, right? So mil spec is like 1,000 spec. And actually in Spain, they would say spec militar, probably. So yeah, military spec. Okay, now I get it. It's a piece of terminology I'm not likely to forget. And I wasn't going to forget the primary and secondary. And so I kept hearing people, for me, quite major authorities even, getting it wrong. And they're saying like, well, I had to put a secondary bevel. I had this Scandi grind, but it was collapsing. The edge was rolling, so I had to put a secondary bevel on there. Well, okay, you did put a secondary bevel on there, but what you did was actually create a new primary bevel, wherein you put a secondary bevel on there, right? But you didn't actually touch the secondary bevel area. You just touched the knot it, right? But now from what I've been reading today, well, there's a Western way of seeing it, and then there's the Eastern way, right? So the Japanese, and I think maybe I got my version from Murray Carter. And now I'm going to have to go and check what Cliff Stamp says. But the Japanese definition is that the primary bevel is the one that does the cutting. And that to me is pretty simple. So that's the one I went with. And I kept hearing people doing it the other way. And I think, wow, I'm going to have to start doing a whole new blade pedant exercise where I go around criticizing people. Well, thank goodness I didn't, because would have made possibly a bit of a fool of myself, since it would transpire that the majority of English-speaking people might hold the contrary view to mine. So, which I'm going to maintain. I'm pinning my flag to the mast of the Japanese viewpoint, right? And I'm just going to say, let's talk politics, okay? The West doesn't always get it right. So I'm calling these two different versions of seeing the matter, alpha and omega, okay? And so pretty much at random, I just selected some examples from a Google search of these two different versions. So I got two omega examples and pretty much one alpha, but I already gave the Japanese one, right? The primary bevel is the bevel that does the cutting, always, okay? But let's check out this from Blade Forums. The primary bevel is the large, flat, or hollow grind, and the secondary is the sharp edge, and the micro bevel for those particular blades, which then raises the question, Well, if you just, if I take this knife and then I put a micro bevel on it, a true micro bevel, which is going to be practically invisible to the naked eye, if not invisible, according to some. Where did my secondary, so now this would be my tertiary bevel? Possibly, because on Reddit, somebody says, the primary bevel is the geometry of the knife. The primary bevel is the geometry of the knife. Now, I find that a rather nebulous statement. The secondary bevel is most often the cutting bevel. So, I mean, effectively, this goes in support of this, and it's not as well phrased. And you can find a lot of arguments to say, and I'm saying that, okay, this is one terminology. And then we have this one from Wicked Edge USA. They say, the primary bevel is always the cutting edge, and the subsequent narrower angled bevels are secondary, tertiary, and so on. That, my friends, dear viewers, is succinct. The secondary grind is the grind that, yes, the primary bevel is the geometry of the knife, okay? So they're saying that this is the geometry of the knife. Well, it's not really. But it is the geometry of the cutting edge in this instance. But what they're saying is that the secondary bevel is most often the cutting bevel. Well, where is the secondary bevel? So in this instance, most often, right? Most often, nebulous, sorry. So the primary bevel is the large, flat, hollow grind. And the secondary, so yes, this has a primary and it has no secondary. But now what you're saying is that you can put a secondary on there and you're cutting with the secondary instead of the primary. You follow? Whereas alpha says the primary bevel is always the cutting edge, right? Primary. Every single knife has one. And then here we have primary, secondary, tertiary, because this has a sort of a convex, some might call it a micro bevel, but I wouldn't. I would call that, a nice slender primary bevel that's lit up there. And then what am I talking about? Yeah, this is primary and secondary. That's the whole point. There is no tertiary here. I don't have an example of a primary, secondary, and tertiary. This is just kind of blended in, pretty, still a little rough, So is this now one bevel or two bevels? See, I would call that one convex secondary bevel with a tiny micro bevel. Well, not that tiny, but, that's what I'm seeing. So, stated my case as to why I will continue to refer to the primary bevel as the cutting edge, and the subsequent narrow angled bevels as secondary, tertiary, and so on. But that does raise the question, well, how to conversationally proceed then. And some people are suggesting online that we need new terminology. And so I had to think about that. And I said, well, yeah, you can talk about the cutting edge, or you could talk about the grinding edge and the sharpening edge, right? Because this is where you sharpen, and that's what you're going to grind on. As you sharpen in, it's going to start getting too thick for you, so you're going to have to grind on it. So now you have a grinding bevel and a sharpening bevel. But the thing is that primary sounds good, and it sounds good for the cutting edge. Thanks for watching.